A camera mounted high on a streetlight captured something that seemed ordinary at first. The person on the screen had no idea what was about to happen next. The footage is quiet and slightly grainy, recorded decades after the crime itself. It shows a small parking area behind a renovated municipal archive building in northern Germany. The year is 2023. A gray van pulls into the lot just after sunset. Two men step out and walk toward a side entrance that requires an employee key card. Both appear calm. Both move with the kind of confidence that suggests they belong there. At that moment, nobody watching the footage understands that the men entering the building are about to trigger the reopening of a murder investigation that had been considered forgotten for more than 30 years. The crime itself happened in the summer of 1991 in a quiet industrial town called Altenbruck, located along a regional highway that connected several small manufacturing communities. At the time, Altenbruck had fewer than 20,000 residents, one police station, and a reputation for being the kind of place where serious crime simply did not occur. On the evening of June 17, 1991, a local mechanic named Karl Brenner failed to return home after closing his auto repair garage. Brenner was 34 years old, married, and known throughout town as someone who rarely missed dinner with his family. When Brenner did not arrive by 9 in the evening, his wife assumed he had stayed late to finish a repair job. By midnight, concern replaced that assumption. The next morning, Brenner's workshop was found locked from the outside. The office lights were still on. Inside, tools were scattered across a workbench as if someone had left in a hurry. Brenner's personal vehicle remained parked behind the building. His wallet sat on the desk next to a receipt book that had been partially filled out. But Karl Brenner was gone. Police officers initially treated the situation as a possible voluntary disappearance. Brenner had no known financial problems and no criminal history. But investigators noted that adults sometimes left their lives behind without warning. That assumption lasted exactly 2 days. On the third day, a farmer discovered something unusual along a service road about 5 kilometers outside town. Tire tracks cut through a narrow patch of grass leading toward an abandoned gravel pit. The farmer followed the tracks and found disturbed soil near a cluster of old construction debris. Police were called immediately. When investigators began digging, they uncovered a body wrapped in a plastic tarp secured with industrial tape. The victim had been beaten severely before death. Identification confirmed what everyone in Altenbruck already feared. Karl Brenner had been murdered. The discovery transformed what had seemed like a missing persons case into the largest criminal investigation the town had ever experienced. Detectives interviewed Brenner's family, employees, customers, and anyone who had visited the garage during the final week of his life. The timeline investigators reconstructed suggested that Brenner closed his workshop around 7:30 in the evening on June 17th. A neighbor working in a nearby warehouse reported seeing Brenner speaking with 2 men in the parking area shortly before the lights inside the garage went dark. The neighbor could not identify the men. He remembered only that they arrived in a dark sedan and appeared to be arguing with Brenner. The witness assumed it was a dispute over a repair bill. When detectives searched the workshop, they found signs of a struggle inside the service bay. A metal toolbox had been knocked onto the floor. One of the hydraulic lifts was partially lowered, and a smear of blood was visible along the concrete surface beneath it. The amount of blood suggested Brenner had been injured there, but not killed inside the garage. Someone had removed him from the building while he was still alive. Investigators began searching for suspects among Brenner's professional contacts. Mechanics often handled expensive vehicles and occasionally became involved in disputes with customers over repairs. Police compiled a list of people who had argued with Brenner in recent months. But none of those disputes escalated beyond verbal confrontations. Within 2 weeks, the investigation reached a frustrating standstill. No witnesses could identify the 2 men seen outside the garage. No fingerprints recovered from the workshop matched anyone in the police database. The sedan described by the warehouse worker had not been seen again. Forensic technology in 1991 was limited compared to modern standards. DNA analysis was rarely used in routine investigations, and many forms of trace evidence simply could not be processed effectively at the time. Detectives suspected the killing had been planned, but they lacked the tools needed to prove it. As weeks turned into months, the Brenner case slowly faded from public attention. Local newspapers stopped publishing updates. New crimes demanded the limited resources of the Altenbrook Police Department. Carl Brenner's murder became what investigators quietly called a cold case. But something about the crime continued to bother one detective in particular. His name was Matthias Keller. Keller had joined the Altenbrook police force only a few years earlier and had been assigned to assist senior investigators on the Brenner case. Unlike many of his colleagues, Keller believed the murder had been carefully organized rather than spontaneous. Several details supported that theory. The tarp used to wrap the body came from a brand sold primarily through industrial supply distributors rather than ordinary retail stores. The tape binding it was the same type commonly used in warehouse shipping operations. The tire tracks discovered near the burial site matched a commercial vehicle pattern rather than a typical passenger car. These details suggested that whoever killed Carl Brenner had access to specialized materials and possibly a workspace outside the garage. Keller documented those observations in the case file, but without suspects, they remained little more than speculation. Years passed. The Brenner investigation remained technically open, but active leads disappeared. Keller eventually transferred to another department. New officers replaced the original investigative team. Boxes containing the case file were moved into storage. For most residents of Altenbrook, the murder of Carl Brenner became a tragic memory from another era. But the story did not end there. 3 decades later, during a national program aimed at digitizing historical police records, thousands of archived documents from regional departments were transferred into a centralized criminal database. The Brenner file was among them. That process might have passed unnoticed if not for a routine review conducted by a federal investigative analyst named Lena Vogt. Vogt specialized in comparing unresolved cases with newly emerging patterns of criminal activity. Her job involved examining decades of archived evidence and identifying connections that earlier investigators could not see. While reviewing the Brenner case file, Vogt noticed something unusual. Several items listed in the original evidence inventory had never been fully analyzed. Among them was a fragment of industrial tape recovered from the victim's clothing. In 1991, forensic laboratories lacked the capability to extract meaningful DNA from adhesive materials. By 2022, that technology had changed dramatically. Vogt authorized the tape fragment to be re-examined. The results returned several weeks later. The laboratory successfully recovered a partial genetic profile from the adhesive surface. When that profile was compared against national databases, it did not match any previously convicted offender. But it did match something else. A sample collected during a recent investigation into a burglary ring operating across multiple German states. The burglary suspects had never been charged with murder. Their crimes involved theft from construction sites and warehouses. However, one member of the group had left biological evidence at a break in that police managed to identify. His name was Tobias Renner. Renner was 49 years old at the time of the database match. According to official records, he had spent most of his adult life working as a logistics contractor, moving freight between regional distribution centers. When Vogt examined Renner's employment history, another detail immediately stood out. In 1991, Tobias Renner had worked for a transport company located less than 10 kilometers from Carl Brenner's garage. The connection alone did not prove anything. But it was enough to reopen the case. Which is how, 32 years after Karl Brenner disappeared from his workshop, investigators began looking again at the murder everyone believed had been forgotten. And that is why, on a quiet evening in 2023, two detectives walked through the side entrance of a municipal archive building carrying a key card and a search warrant. Because what they had just discovered suggested that Karl Brenner's killers had never stopped watching the case. They had simply been waiting for the world to forget it. When investigators reopened the Brenner case, the first question was simple. Why would someone commit such a violent crime in 1991 and then disappear completely for more than 3 decades? The partial DNA profile recovered from the tape provided the first real lead in the investigation, but it did not yet explain the crime itself. Tobias Renner had never been suspected of murder. His criminal history consisted primarily of property offenses, stolen equipment, unauthorized transport of industrial materials, and several warehouse burglaries that occurred many years after Karl Brenner's death. At first glance, the connection seemed weak, but Lena Vogt believed the link deserved closer examination. The evidence fragment containing Renner's DNA came from adhesive tape used to secure the tarp around Brenner's body. That meant whoever handled the tape had direct contact with the victim after the attack. Even if Renner had not committed the murder himself, he had been physically present during the disposal of the body. Investigators began reconstructing Renner's background in detail. Employment records from the early 1990s showed that Renner worked for a freight transport company called Nord Transit Logistics. The company specialized in moving construction equipment, heavy machinery, and bulk materials between industrial clients. Drivers often worked irregular routes and spent long hours traveling through rural areas. Renner was not a driver. He worked in warehouse operations, primarily handling cargo packaging and shipment preparation. That job required exactly the type of industrial materials discovered at the Brenner crime scene. The tarp used to wrap the body was a heavy-duty protective cover designed for transport pallets. The adhesive tape securing it matched a shipping brand widely used in freight facilities during the early 1990s. Investigators confirmed that Nord Transit Logistics had purchased large quantities of the same materials during that time period. This did not yet prove Renner's involvement, but it established access. Detectives also examined Renner's known associates from that period. Employment rosters revealed that several individuals who worked alongside Renner at Nord Transit had long criminal histories involving theft, fraud, and organized cargo diversion schemes. 2 names appeared repeatedly in those records: Martin Döring and Stefan Kruger. Both men were employed at the same warehouse facility as Renner in 1991. Both later appeared in multiple police reports connected to transport-related crimes, and both maintained long-term contact with Renner, according to phone records recovered during the recent burglary investigation. Detectives began building a timeline of the 3 men's activities. The pattern that emerged suggested a long-standing partnership. Renner handled packaging and inventory documentation inside the warehouse. Döring drove freight trucks across regional routes. Kruger specialized in vehicle maintenance and mechanical repair. Together, they formed an informal network capable of moving goods without attracting attention. At some point in the late 1980s, investigators believe the group began stealing cargo from their employer. Small quantities of equipment disappeared first: spare engine components, power tools, construction hardware, items that could easily be sold without raising suspicion. Over time, the thefts became more organized. The group learned how to manipulate shipment records, reroute deliveries, and conceal missing inventory within legitimate transport operations. By 1991, investigators believed the 3 men had developed a side business selling stolen equipment across several nearby towns. Karl Brenner's garage entered the story because of a mechanical failure. Transport logs recovered decades later revealed that a Nord Transit delivery truck experienced a brake system malfunction during a regional shipment in early June of 1991. The truck required emergency repair and was towed to the nearest available mechanic. That mechanic was Carl Brenner. At the time, Brenner's garage was known for handling heavy vehicle repairs. Brenner had previously serviced commercial transport trucks and possessed the equipment needed to inspect industrial braking systems. According to surviving maintenance records, Brenner completed the repair work 2 days later. But investigators now believe Brenner discovered something he was never supposed to see. During the brake inspection, Brenner likely examined the cargo area of the truck. Mechanics often inspected trailers for structural damage when diagnosing mechanical problems. Inside that trailer, investigators believe Brenner found equipment that had not been reported on any official shipment manifest: stolen equipment. The theory gained strength when detectives uncovered a financial ledger belonging to Martin Düring during the burglary investigation decades later. Among the handwritten entries were references to cargo sales dating back to the early 1990s. One entry stood out. The entry referenced a dispute involving the mechanic in Altenbrook. No name was written beside the note, but the timing matched the week of Carl Brenner's murder. Investigators now believe Brenner confronted the men after discovering the stolen cargo. Brenner had a reputation for being direct and uncompromising. Several former customers recalled Brenner refusing repair work if he suspected a vehicle had been involved in illegal activity. It is possible Brenner threatened to report the discovery. If that happened, the cargo theft operation faced immediate exposure. Reporting the stolen equipment could have led investigators directly to the Nord Transit warehouse and exposed years of illegal activity. For Renner, Düring, and Kruger, the risk may have seemed catastrophic. Instead of abandoning the operation, investigators believe the men decided to silence Brenner. The planning likely began within days of the repair incident. Phone records from 1991 were largely unavailable, but archived employment schedules showed that all 3 men had the same day off work on June 17th, the day Brenner disappeared. That coincidence drew immediate attention from investigators. Witness testimony from the warehouse employee who saw Brenner arguing with 2 men outside the garage also matched the theory. The witness described one of the men as tall, with broad shoulders and short hair. Martin Düring matched that description almost exactly. The second man appeared slightly younger and remained near the car during the argument. Stefan Kruger fit that role, according to investigators reviewing the testimony. What remains unclear is whether the murder itself had been fully planned or if the confrontation escalated unexpectedly. Evidence from the garage suggested Brenner fought back after the men entered the workshop. The scattered tools and damaged equipment indicated a struggle that likely lasted several minutes. Investigators believe Brenner was beaten unconscious, using a heavy metal wrench recovered from the floor near the hydraulic lift. The weapon itself was never recovered, but impact patterns on Brenner's injuries suggested the tool had been used repeatedly. Once Brenner lost consciousness, the attackers faced a decision. Leaving him alive meant risking identification. The medical examiner's original report concluded that Brenner died from severe cranial trauma and internal bleeding consistent with prolonged assault. The injuries likely occurred inside the garage before the body was transported to the burial site. After Brenner's death, investigators believe Renner retrieved the industrial tarp and tape from the Nord Transit warehouse. The materials were used to wrap the body before transporting it outside town. Tire track patterns found near the gravel pit matched commercial transport vehicles commonly used by freight companies at the time. The burial itself appeared rushed. The grave was shallow and poorly concealed, suggesting the attackers had limited time before sunrise or potential witnesses could appear. Once the body was hidden, the men returned to their normal routines. And for more than 30 years, that plan appeared to work. Karl Brenner's murder remained unsolved. Renner continued working in logistics for several companies across the region. Doering eventually left transport work and moved into independent hauling contracts. Kruger operated a small vehicle repair shop in another town. None of them were ever questioned about the murder in 1991. But the investigators reviewing the reopened case began to notice something unsettling. The burglary ring that eventually led police to Tobias Renner did not appear suddenly. Records suggested that the group had resumed organized theft operations in the early 2000s, and this time the crimes were far more sophisticated. Instead of small equipment thefts, the group targeted entire freight shipments worth hundreds of thousands of euros. Cargo trucks vanished along rural highways and were later discovered empty in remote industrial areas. Many of those thefts involved mechanical tampering that forced drivers to stop their vehicles. Investigators reviewing those incidents began asking a disturbing question. If Renner, Doering, and Kruger had been willing to kill once to protect their operation in 1991, what had stopped them from doing it again? The answer to that question began to emerge as detectives searched Renner's property in 2023. Inside a locked storage container behind Renner's house, investigators found several boxes filled with documents dating back decades. Most of the papers involved shipment records, vehicle registrations, and maintenance reports. But one folder contained something different: handwritten notes describing surveillance routes, lists of delivery schedules, and several entries referencing specific individuals who had asked too many questions. One of those names appeared in a note dated 2003. Next to the name was a single sentence: handled the same way as the mechanic. At that moment, investigators realized something chilling. Karl Brenner may not have been the only victim. And if that was true, the men responsible had spent more than 30 years perfecting a system designed to make people disappear. Which meant the reopened investigation was no longer about solving a single forgotten murder. It was about uncovering how many others had been buried along the way. By the time investigators finished analyzing the documents found in Tobias Renner's storage container, the case had changed completely. What had once been considered a single murder from 1991 was now being treated as the possible beginning of a much larger pattern of crimes. The notes recovered from Renner's files described delivery schedules, vehicle routes, and locations where freight shipments regularly stopped for mechanical checks. Some pages included hand-drawn maps showing isolated parking areas along regional highways. Other entries listed names of drivers, repair technicians, and warehouse employees. One entry referenced the mechanic in Altenbrook. Another referred to a driver who had noticed missing cargo. The pattern suggested that anyone who threatened to expose the theft operation was carefully documented, and sometimes eliminated. Federal investigators joined the case within days. Because the crimes potentially crossed several state borders, the investigation quickly expanded beyond the small town where Karl Brenner had been killed more than 3 decades earlier. Detectives began examining unsolved disappearances connected to freight transport routes across central Germany. Within the first week, analysts identified 3 cases that raised immediate concern. All involved men who worked in logistics or vehicle repair. All had disappeared after reporting irregularities in cargo shipments. And all cases had originally been classified as missing persons with no confirmed evidence of foul play. One disappearance occurred in 2003. Another occurred in 2008. The third happened in 2016. Each case shared one additional similarity. All 3 victims had interacted with companies connected to Tobias Renner's transport network. At that point, investigators obtained arrest warrants. But when officers arrived at Renner's residence in early spring of 2023, the house was empty. Renner had disappeared. The timing suggested that someone had warned him. Inside the house, investigators found signs of hurried departure. Several drawers had been emptied. A laptop computer was missing. A safe in the bedroom had been forced open from the inside. Renner had taken only a few belongings and left behind most personal items. That meant the escape had been planned quickly. Detectives immediately contacted Martin Doring and Stefan Kruger. Doring answered the phone and agreed to meet investigators the same afternoon. Kruger did not respond to calls. When officers arrived at Kruger's repair shop later that evening, the building was closed and locked. Kruger was also gone. Within 48 hours, both men were officially listed as fugitives. The investigation transformed into a nationwide manhunt. Border authorities were alerted. Transportation companies were asked to report any unusual freight movements connected to Renner's former business contacts. Investigators also began tracking financial transactions linked to the suspects. Renner's bank accounts had been emptied shortly before his disappearance. Surveillance footage from a cash machine in another city showed him withdrawing money late at night, 2 days before police arrived at his home. He appeared calm in the recording. But the manhunt quickly revealed an important mistake. Renner had used his personal vehicle to travel south through a series of toll stations. Those toll cameras recorded the car's license plate multiple times over a 3-hour period. Investigators used that information to reconstruct his route. The vehicle eventually left the highway network near a remote industrial area outside the city of Kassel. Officers located the car abandoned in a parking lot near a freight distribution terminal. But Renner was not there. Instead, investigators discovered something that suggested the fugitives were still working together. Inside the vehicle's trunk were several items connected to Martin Doring's hauling company. A set of transport documents listed shipment destinations across 3 different regions. One of those shipments was scheduled to depart the following morning. The manhunt shifted focus immediately. Investigators suspected the fugitives planned to escape using commercial freight routes that crossed multiple borders without attracting attention. Truck drivers often worked long shifts and passed through several countries in a single day. If Renner and Kruger managed to leave Germany inside a cargo vehicle, locating them could become extremely difficult. Authorities began monitoring freight terminals connected to Doring's company. That decision proved critical. Late the next evening, a transport supervisor reported that one of Doring's contracted trucks had departed unexpectedly with incomplete paperwork. The truck had been scheduled for maintenance, not transport. The vehicle's GPS tracker showed it traveling along a rural highway heading toward the Austrian border. Police units were dispatched immediately, but the highway network offered dozens of potential exit routes. By the time officers arrived near the last recorded location, the truck had already left the main road. A helicopter unit located the vehicle several hours later, parked near an abandoned warehouse complex, surrounded by forest. Officers approached cautiously. The warehouse doors were partially open and lights were visible inside the building. When police entered, they found Martin Doring standing beside the truck. He did not attempt to run. Doring was taken into custody without resistance. Inside the warehouse, investigators discovered several crates containing stolen construction equipment. The scene confirmed that the suspects were still actively involved in cargo theft operations. But Tobias Renner and Stefan Kruger were not present. During interrogation, Doring initially refused to cooperate. He denied knowledge of Karl Brenner's murder and claimed the warehouse was being used only for temporary storage. Investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence linking Renner to the tape used in Brenner's burial. Doring's response was silence. Then investigators presented something else. Among the documents found in Renner's storage container was a ledger listing profits from stolen shipments dating back more than 20 years. Several entries were signed using initials that matched Doring's handwriting. One entry included a date from the week Karl Brenner died. At that point, Doring realized the case against them was far stronger than he expected. After several hours, he began to talk. According to Doring, The confrontation with Carl Brenner in 1991 had not been intended as murder. The men had visited the garage to intimidate Brenner and convince him to remain silent about the stolen cargo. But Brenner refused. During the argument inside the workshop, Brenner grabbed a metal tool and attempted to force the men out of the building. The fight escalated quickly. Kruger struck Brenner first, knocking him to the floor. Renner then joined the assault. Doring claimed he tried to stop the attack, but investigators later concluded that statement was likely an attempt to minimize his role in the crime. Once Brenner stopped moving, the men realized they could not leave him alive. Doring admitted helping transport the body to the gravel pit outside town. When investigators asked why they resumed cargo theft years later, Doring gave a simple answer: because they believed the murder had been forgotten. The interrogation also revealed the final location of the remaining fugitives. According to Doring, Renner and Kruger planned to cross into Austria using a secondary freight route. A contact in the transport industry had agreed to provide a vehicle that could carry them across the border disguised as warehouse employees. Authorities moved quickly. 2 days later, Austrian police located a truck matching the description provided by Doring, parked at a roadside cargo station near the border. Officers surrounded the vehicle and ordered the occupants to exit. Stefan Kruger stepped out first. Tobias Renner followed moments later. Both men were arrested without violence. The arrests ended a manhunt that had lasted just under 3 weeks, but the investigation itself continued for months. Forensic teams re-examined evidence from the 3 additional disappearance cases connected to the suspects. DNA analysis confirmed that Renner and Kruger had been present at locations where 2 of those victims were last seen. One of the missing men was eventually discovered buried near an abandoned quarry outside another town. The discovery confirmed investigators' fears. Carl Brenner had not been the only victim. In court, prosecutors described the group as a criminal partnership that began with cargo theft and escalated into murder when their operation faced exposure. Evidence presented during the trial included the DNA recovered from the tape, the handwritten ledgers documenting illegal shipments, and testimony from Martin Doring describing the events inside Brenner's garage. The trial lasted several months. When the verdict was announced, Tobias Renner and Stefan Kruger were convicted of murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of organized cargo theft. Martin Doring received a reduced sentence after cooperating with investigators, but he was still convicted for his role in the killing. The Brenner case officially closed more than 32 years after the crime occurred. Carl Brenner's family attended the final hearing. For decades, they had lived without answers, unsure whether the truth about that night in 1991 would ever emerge. When the judge read the verdict, Brenner's brother later told reporters that the family finally felt something they had not experienced in years: closure. But the investigation left investigators with one final realization. The murder of Carl Brenner had not been an act of sudden violence. It had been the first step in a criminal operation that believed silence could last forever. For more than 30 years, the men responsible assumed that time would erase the evidence. Instead, the one piece of tape they used to hide a body became the detail that exposed everything.